where you're like breathing is literally like, it's got to that point where it's like, I've lost it. Well, remembering that it's carbon dioxide that's making you lose it, we can specifically, we call it like CO2 dumping, like get rid of CO2 is great, it's good, but too much of it, like anything, too much of it is bad. It's driving your breathing out of control. I can like a few specific dumps of get rid of that CO2 effectively and quickly so that I can regain my breathing back under control is going to be beneficial for trying to recover quickly during bouts of like super high intensity work.
Hey, welcome to the Body's Built Better podcast. I am your host, Jackie Tan, and I am so grateful that you are with me today. This show is all about human performance, and we really try and encompass everything that means. Yes, we talk to athletes and authors and coaches all about the physical side of performance, but we also want to dive into the emotional, the mindset, the spiritual, really everything it means to perform at your best. So if that is your thing, you are in the right place, my friend, because we explore the body's incredible ability to heal, adapt, and evolve so you can crush limitations, reconnect your body and mind, and discover your extraordinary potential. And today on the show, I chat with Oxygen Advantage Master Instructor and Breathwork Coach, David Jackson, better known as Jacko, and we chat all things breathing. Now, I know what you're thinking. What is there possibly to know about the thing that we do every second of every day of our lives? Well, turns out there's a whole lot that you need to know, and actually we're probably not doing it all that great. Could we be doing it better? Yes, of course. Could we use it to our advantage so that we can improve our performance? Absolutely. And that's what we chat about today. Jacko dives deep into what the biochemistry, the biomechanics around breathing, the importance of carbon dioxide, why we need it. He breaks down the BOLT score, what it is, why you need to know it, and how you can use it to measure your breathing progress and tolerance to carbon dioxide, and ultimately, how that will improve your performance. And obviously, so many other positive aspects and the flow-on effect of that. Improved focus, cognitive function, better sleep, better stress management, and the list goes on. Regardless if you're an athlete of any level or not, breathing is a part of life, and the better we can do that, the better quality of life that we will have. And make sure you stick around to the end of the show, because Jacko takes us through a brilliant exercise that helps you to locate your diaphragm, feel it, and use it effectively. Now, I've never done this exercise before, and it really did blow my mind. It was by far the best thing I've ever done to know where the diaphragm is, to even feel it under my fingertips. And it's something that I know will be really effective for all of you out there who have a hard time knowing whether you're using and integrating the rib cage through your breathing. So this is a must try. So hang around to the end for that. Without further ado, let's dive straight into this episode with Jacko. Jacko, thank you so much for chatting with me today. Welcome to the Body's Built Better podcast.
Thank you. I feel like I'm actually in Australia. It is so hot right now in the UK. I'm literally like dying. Hence why
Which would
I
explain the
am
bare
wearing some
chest.
shorts. I promise that, but I won't. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, you are a master Oxygen Advantage instructor. You're teaching people all over the world, and you're working with clubs and athletes as well and improving their performance with breathwork, which I'm really looking forward to diving deeper into today. But before we do, you were a pro rugby player and your career was cut short, and I'll let you get into why. But I feel like that's a really great place or introduction to start with, because I feel like that kind of led you down this path of breathwork.
Uh, yeah, no, you're right. Um, as you were saying that, I was like, well, I'm trying. We're all trying now. I'm trying to do these things, and I tried to play rugby myself. And you just told me that you've done you've done the Oxford certification, so you know it all already. You don't need me for this, but we'll see if we can add a little bit of detail sometimes. I played professional rugby here in the UK in the Championship for my hometown club, Nottingham, and I'd had a series of head injuries throughout my career. The first one when I was 16, and it started off with sort of like a typical sort of concussion symptoms and sort of back to normal within a couple of weeks. Or even feeling normal after just a few hours, probably, and then back actually able to play in a couple of weeks or whatever. But then that carried on through my career, and it was getting easier and easier to knock me out, and my symptoms were becoming worse and worse. So there was this cumulative effect which I wasn't aware of, or we didn't get told about until 2013. We're playing touch in the warm up. Two of us on the same team went to catch the ball, and we just banged into each other, and it was nothing. Like one of the lads said, it was funny. He was about to start laughing, but then as I hit the floor, I started having a seizure. So I was fitting on the floor, and he said everyone sort of got serious and put me in the recovery position. And as typical with seizures, it's a sign of like having a bleed. Luckily, mine was it was a small bleed, and didn't need to have surgery or anything like that. But it was, and I mean, I spent a few months trying to get back to playing. It wasn't until I had an MRI in I think like the December. So I had the head injury in August 2013. It wasn't until the December I had the MRI, which by then the bleed was like a scar on my brain. And that's when the specialist said, well, looking at your injury history, the build up of those head injuries of what's making it so bad now, lasting so long, yet the impact was so small. And then the penny started dropping for me when I was like then looking back on how it had progressively got worse. It then started to become really obvious, and it was like, oh, didn't realize that it was that was happening. So things, I had to retire and things had to change. I initially actually did. I wouldn't call it not movement coach, but I did PT, and then went into strength and conditioning. Worked as a strength and conditioning coach with a lot of Paralympic athletes, and then which was a great experience. And then during that time, the advice to rehabilitate from a brain injury was very limited. It probably still is, but there's more understanding. Now, I came across some research linking gut health and brain injuries, and I'd had an ulcer on my tongue from the day that I had the injury. I think maybe I bit my tongue or something, but I 3 years later, I still had this ulcer on my tongue, like it just wouldn't go. And then I had some skin irritations that I'd never previously had before. And so as experiment, it was like, okay, this is interesting. It felt like something was linked to me. And then there was some research talking about if you've had a brain injury or a concussive event, it's highly likely that brain gut axis has been disrupted. And I was like, well, I think I'm experiencing some of that. And then there was some more saying that if you've had a concussive event or some sort of brain injury, it doesn't have to be something like really severe like mine, but for your respiratory center, which is in the brainstem, to be affected and creating abnormalities to your breathing, dysfunctional breathing, more sensitive to carbon dioxide, ultimately reducing the blood flow and oxygen supply to the brain. And it was basically, I think the stats, it was like, 99.9% chance of having dysfunctional breathing if you've had a brain injury. So I was like, well, that's me. Did some of the tests, did some of the assessments like the Bolt score. And I was like, my Bolt score was less than 10 seconds. That's like, well, we can explain what that is. But basically, a test of how sensitive you are to the buildup of carbon dioxide, and that put me less than 10 seconds was like a category of severe asthma, and I was like, I've never had asthma. I never even felt like I had a problem with my breathing. It was quite eye-opening for me, and quite normally my ego, if something was difficult, I wasn't good at something, normally my ego would get in the way and be like, oh, it's just it's not rubbish, it's not for me, whatever. But just understanding, Patrick McKeon with the book was the Oxford Advantage. That was the first thing I read. Did such a fantastic job in explaining the science and the chemistry behind how our breathing is impacting our physiology that I just couldn't ignore it, and I was just like all in on it. And it was to help me with my rehab. But at that time I was it took me about a year to run without getting headaches, and I'll stop talking in a second. It took me about a year to run without getting headaches. But when it was about 3 years after my head injury when I started seeing some of this research and starting reading it might have even been 2018. I read the Oxford Advantage book, so it was quite some time afterwards. But to me, it felt like I was intrigued because it felt like something. I felt like I was back to normal, but something just wasn't quite right. Like I had the handbrake on in the car, and you're like pulling off, and you're like, what's going on? Like there's something holding me back just slightly. And so I was at that point, I was back running and doing like 5Ks. And I went from like a 20-minute 5K, which is all right. It's not like setting any world records, but it's a reasonable time. I'd knocked a minute off my 5K time by practicing just some of the simple nasal breathing and managing airflow type of just staying better in control of breath and understanding why deeper, slower, bigger breathing is better than like fast, shallow breathing when you're really pushing it and out of breath. And that'd be some really good stuff to talk about for some of the people that are involved in or the athletic population in 6 weeks. And I was like, that actually was the biggest hook for me. And I was like, wow, like look at the difference that's had in 6 weeks. And I don't even really know what I'm doing. I'm just trying to breathe through my nose during the day. I'm trying to like breathe with my diaphragm when I'm running, but I don't know. Well, how does it? I'm like, am I using my diaphragm? What does it feel like to breathe through the diaphragm? I was like, I don't know. No one teaches us these things. So I was then like, wow, how would this? I was like, starting to think, I wish I knew this when I played rugby. So there's an element for me where I get passionate about. I didn't like it wasn't there then when I played rugby. There was no information about it. About sharing that with other people now that are still in the game or still in their sport. But then it started to, the more I engaged with it, it started to broaden out into the wider sort of like, how is this impacting my brain health? How is this impacting my mood? How is this impacting my sleep and just how I feel day to day? How I'm able to manage stress better by understanding how my breathing influences my stress response. So I've really enjoyed working with clients that sort of in the sporting world, but also with clients that are struggling with stress, anxiety, or in corporate environment where we're helping people with demanding jobs, like managing those stresses, and be able to come home and have a tool with the breath that helps them to down-regulate, be more present at home with the family and everything else that sort of goes in between. I always say to people, like, we're always breathing. In life, you're always either breathing in, breathing out, or holding your breath. One of those three, it's dead obvious, and people we laugh because it is so obvious. But that's what I love about the breathing is that it is obvious and it is simple, so we can get our heads around it when we start to think, okay, one of those three things is always happening. Otherwise, you're dead. It's like you need the breath. Literally, is like what's keeping you alive. And I think that just because it's automatic, for one doesn't mean it's optimal. And actually, when something's automatic, it means that the brain is going down the path of least resistance. It's doing whatever's easiest. So that might not be optimal. It's going to find whatever's the least resistance. It's typically more sort of mouth breathing, as an example. But also, just because it's automatic, we take it for granted. And that's not a bad thing, in that, like, we need to take, you can't be, if you spend all day only trying to be better at breathing and don't do anything else, like you forget to eat and it's your days, you're not going to be very productive in this world and have a positive impact in the world. But there's opportunities and times where we can do something with our breathing to enhance it, to allow it to be more efficient, to take away some of the restraints that modern day life put on us, which impact our breathing. And I try to explain it in a way to people when we're doing like a session. We'll go like, I believe our body knows how to breathe and how it's designed to breathe. And we can see that when we look at like the function of the nose, how the lungs and the diaphragm and how the blood or how it's all set up. Like it's designed to do it in a particular way that's very, very efficient. And when we allow ourselves to the body to show us how efficient it can be with our breathing, it can be very calm, it can be very relaxed, you can do very little of it, yet feel really good, rather than breathing more and breathing faster doesn't necessarily make you feel any better. And we can explore like the physiology behind why that's the case. Apologies, you asked me one very small question about how does he get into it? And I'm like, 10 minutes later, I'm like, Jacko, shut up.
No. This is your journey, and it's perfect. It's exactly right, though. Like you've said, we laugh because it's so simple, but actually, there are so many people that don't do it functionally or correctly, or they're just so inefficient at it. And so, my next question is, what's the basics of breathings? And people can totally just stop there and take the piss out of that question, but really so many people aren't doing it very well. And if we could do it well and even better, then why wouldn't you? I mean, it improves all facets of your life. So let's go there. The basics of breathing, it's not only, you said, it's a movement pattern as well as, what's happening on a biochemistry level. So what are the basics of breathing?
I should be able to answer this in less than 10 minutes.
The time is on.
I love what you said. I love what you said. I can tell as a strength and conditioning coach or as a movement coach, like looking at things as it's a movement pattern. Like there's bones and there's joints and there's muscles and there's things having to move to make air come in and out. And if we're talking about the basics, and we're talking about we'll just talk about like our base level of breathing, like day to day, rather than how it's gonna, when we start exercising or doing sports, it's gonna change because your metabolic demand is increasing. Your body's gonna chew up and need more oxygen, and you're gonna create an awful lot more CO2, and that's gonna change things a little bit. But it does start though with, what's your day-to-day breathing like? What's your day-to-day habits of breathing like? Do you breathe with the nose or do you breathe with the mouth? Do you breathe fast or do you breathe slow? Do you breathe deep? And deep doesn't necessarily mean big. It's like how low down we're doing it. So are we breathing with the diaphragm, or is it more upper chest driven? Because if you breathe poorly at rest, when your breathing isn't being challenged, you just get worse at breathing when you start exercising. But at rest, you're not being challenged through your breathing. So it's like the silent assassin. Most people don't know, and we're not aware that our breathing at rest is dysfunctional because it's not being challenged enough for it to show us that it's being dysfunctional. If you can see someone breathing dysfunctionally at rest, in that they're sat there and they're like, and you can visually see my upper chest and shoulders and my mouth open, like I'm quite far gone at that point. Do you know what I mean? That's quite significant.
But it's so common, though, isn't it?
Someone could be sat here breathing at rest. Yeah. But it'd be even more common that you'll see someone, and I might just be sat here like this, and you're looking at my breathing, and you can't really necessarily notice. But then you ask me to count my breathing. Let's count your respiratory rate, and I just count my breaths, and I'm like, I'm 16 breaths per minute. I mean, you have some people when they're super sort of like stressed, and they might look okay looking at them, and then like if we're doing like a group session, you're looking around the group and you're trying to get a bit of a gauge on people, and then you're like, we count our breathing at the start to get a bit of a gauge, and it's like it's actually it's a beautiful thing when people are completely unaware. So they don't know, but they also don't know whether this number is good or bad. And they'll just say like, someone might, don't pick on people, but someone will be like, yeah, mine's 22, and they're like, they don't know if that's good or bad or anything. They're just like, yeah, I'm 22 breaths per minute. And I'm like, okay, let's set the scene here a little bit. We want it to be about 10. And when I'm running like a 25-minute 5K or sort of like a 50-minute 10K pace, I'm breathing about 20 breaths per minute. And this isn't oh wow, look at me, I'm so good. It's just you're sat down doing nothing, but your body's working as hard as if I'm running at a reasonable pace. Like, and the penny drops over going, okay, this is a problem. And one of the things it can come down, I promise I wasn't going to answer this in 10 minutes, didn't I? But the inefficiency of each of those 22 breaths is causing it to stay being fast, and we can't get out of that cycle unless we understand like how to actually change and breathe a little bit more effectively. And we can talk about some detail we can make it sound complicated, but I try to make it as simple as possible. And if people only take away one thing from this for their day-to-day breathing at rest, is if you do two things. If you try to breathe through the nose and you try to breathe quietly, like that's a great starting point. And actually that's a very easy thing for anyone to like tangibly try and do. Just occasionally throughout the day, just notice, are you breathing through the nose, and can you hear you breathing, or can you make it quiet? And if you're breathing quietly, it means you're breathing slowly. Like those two things go hand in hand. You can't breathe fast but make no noise. Okay. And then those two things then link up together. The nose, very much smaller holes than that big hole in the middle of your face, your mouth. So that provides more resistance. That resistance gives your diaphragm something to pull against. The slower breathing that quiet breathing provides gives you time for that diaphragm to go through some good function and for those ribs to move out on your inhales and back together on the exhale. So by breathing through the nose and breathing quietly, which then means you're breathing slowly, you're setting yourself up to be for a better opportunity to diaphragmatically breathe and have a better like biomechanics of your breathing. Like that's not to say someone breathes through the nose, they can't just breathe crap, but you're setting yourself up for that if you try and make it quiet as well. We'll do some stuff on like, okay, let's try a couple of exercises to get the diaphragm going and feel the ribs and that type of stuff, because it's all nice simple stuff that people could just, you don't even need to have the visual, you could just listen to what we're doing and it can be quite simple. Sorry, I said I was going to answer that quickly.
Yeah. No, absolutely. We'll definitely do that at the end, because I think that's so important, especially with that diaphragmatic breath, because prior to learning this, for me personally, I would do yoga, and you hear constantly belly breath. And for me, I take things very literal. So when I breathed in, I'm making sure that my belly would move, and I can move my belly without moving my rib cage. I'm really good at being able to, make my body do whatever it is I'm hearing that I need to be doing or applying. And I'm not saying that my rib cage doesn't move at all. Obviously there is some movement because that's how the body is built. But in saying that, it what certainly wasn't the most efficient way to be breathing for me, because that's how I took it on board. Definitely we'll get onto that a bit later because that's really important. Can you tell us, I really want to have this conversation about carbon dioxide for a minute, because we all know, we need oxygen. But in actual fact, a lot of us are getting too much oxygen, and that's why, there's anxiety, because this whole, chest breathing, mouth breathing, and we're not offloading that carbon dioxide like we should be. But where the conversation is always around oxygen, I'd really love to, especially in the general population anyway, can you tell us why carbon dioxide is really important for us?
It's a really great question. There's two things in that question of like, it's not that we're not with the carbon dioxide, it's more that when we're breathing fast, we're offloading too much of it. Then with the oxygen, it's not that we're getting too much oxygen. It's not that we're getting too much oxygen in. Like there's only like someone's, I haven't got it with me. Like you can, like a little pulse oximeter you can put on your finger, like normal levels of oxygen. So normal oxygen, it's called, like I love these words, normoxy, like oxy being oxygen and norm, like they just stick them together and you go, that's like technical term. Someone just made that up.
That's
like,
right.
So,
We'll
so
trademark
normoxy is like 95, 95 to 99%. We don't want, that's the percentage of red blood cells occupied by oxygen, like the hemoglobin occupied by oxygen. So oxygen is getting carried primarily in your blood by by the hemoglobin in red blood cells. And once all that's like full, like you can't have more than 100% because it's a percentage, right? And the other thing being that every roughly when you're taking a breath in, about 75% of the oxygen that you breathe in, you breathe back out again. Like it's not that every bit of oxygen that you breathe in, your body's like utilizing and able to do. The carbon dioxide is got a couple of really, really key roles that it plays. It's the catalyst that allows the oxygen that's being carried by the hemoglobin red blood cells to be released. That was someone, Christian Bohr in 1904, discovered that. He's obviously far cleverer than I am. I just remember the date that he discovered it. But it's cool when you do something like that, right? Because then they name it after you. It's called the Bohr. They call it the Bohr effect. And so that's when we understand that, we say, okay, so if I get rid of too much carbon dioxide, oxygen's not able to easily or readily leave the bloodstream and get into the tissues. So then I still feel like I'm out of breath and then carry on breathing. You're taking all that oxygen in, but you're not using much of it, and then it's not getting out of the blood. So the other thing that carbon dioxide does, it helps blood vessels dilate, so it helps with circulation. So if the opposite being them constricting. So if we're breathing too fast, greater than our metabolic demands, we're offloading too much carbon dioxide on those exhalations. Oxygen is staying more strongly bound to the hemoglobin in red blood cells, and your blood vessels starting to constrict, so your circulation starts to become worse. So not only is the blood circulation being restricted, the oxygen that's in the blood isn't wanting to leave so readily either, and hence why when you're panting fast like that during exercise, you don't recover your breathing very quickly. You only really recover your breathing when you're breathing like that once your exercise intensity is dropped to such a low level that you will eventually, you're carrying on breathing, so it's happening, but it's just happening really, 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 really inefficiently. There's some inefficiencies around like breathing into the upper chest rather than low down, and the speed at which you're breathing, some inefficiencies and losing too much air in dead space. But to just hone in on that bit with carbon dioxide of why is it so important, I think is a good thing to understand. Your brain, also the respiratory, the central chemoreceptors in the brainstem that are monitoring or controlling your breathing patterns, particularly the size of the breath you take and the speed at which you're breathing, are located in the brainstem. You've got like the midbrain, ponsum, and the medulla in the brainstem, and those central chemoreceptors are most sensitive to changes in carbon dioxide and blood pH. And carbon dioxide and blood pH go hand in hand together. And so if you're hearing this for the first time, it's one of those things that seems really counterintuitive. But when your brain tells you to take your next breath, and you can do this with, like, if you try and hold your breath, the first thing you do is when you finish that breath hold is breathe out, because your brain's trying to get you to get rid of the CO2 that's building up when you're holding your breath. Or if anyone's come across any sort of like hyperventilation work, like Wim Hof, Tumo style breathing with the Wim Hof method, someone can hold their breath for 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes after they've done lots of big hyperventilation breathing, getting rid of all that carbon dioxide, getting rid of the stimulus to breathe. And then you can sit there and you can hold your breath for 2, 3 minutes. You're not even trying. Like, it feels really blissful, because it's like this, there's no impulse to breathe, because not because you've got more oxygen in, like it's that you've got rid of the stimulus to breathe, which is the carbon dioxide. And I think the biggest question is, or people don't seem to ask, I've been asking this question more recently, it's like, but why is carbon dioxide the stimulus to breathe? Why would the brain, like, oxygen is the most important. If we haven't got oxygen in, we know we're going to die, so surely it's oxygen. But as I mentioned, 75% of the oxygen that you breathe in, you breathe back out again. It's not actually changing as much minute by minute as, or moment by moment, as the carbon dioxide is. And carbon dioxide makes the blood more acidic, and your brain or your body is very stringent about the changes in blood pH that you're allowed. I think it needs to be about 7.4, something like that, and it only has to change by a few sort of decimal places. I think if it's like down to 6.8, like you're dead. So it doesn't want to move by very much. Yeah. And carbon dioxide gets carried in the blood as carbonic acid and dissociates into a H plus ion and bicarbonate. And it's the H plus ion that's creating that acidity within the blood, influences the pH. And because the carbon dioxide is influencing the pH of the blood moment by moment, and the body is very keen on keeping the blood pH in very fine margins, it's actually utilizing sensory receptors or chemoreceptors that are sensitive to that change in pH and carbon dioxide to decide like how fast you need to breathe or how big you need to breathe based on what is the current level of CO2 within the system. If we feel like if those sensory receptors, those chemoreceptors, like got too much CO2, it's like breathe faster, breathe bigger. Yeah, because pH has gone down, it's become more acidic. If we end up with higher pH, more alkali, then the system will go, okay, let's just slow down the breathing, let's breathe a bit smaller, let's let that CO2 come back up and let that pH stay a little bit more, or get back to balance. The kidneys will play a role in managing the pH of the system, but it takes a lot longer. It's like hours or days, I think, if for the kidneys to like influence the pH of the system, whereas your breathing influences it moment by moment. And so that's why the brain, that's what we currently understand as to why the brain is using carbon dioxide and pH to modulate our breathing. Your blood oxygen saturation has to drop to below like 50% before peripheral receptors, chemoreceptors that are responsive to oxygen, before they actually kick in to stimulate you to breathe. So your feeling of like when you're exercising and you're feeling like I need to, and you get to that like I'm really being like my breathing's really being challenged. That's not because oxygen's low, and you can put a pulse oximeter on your blood oxygen will still be like in the 90s comfortably. Might even still be normal. But it's because the levels of CO2 within your body will have increased so much, and your brain is saying need to get rid of it. Now, with this in the sporting context, can get quite interesting because we can train ourselves. The body adapts to any stimulus we place upon it, and beautifully so. We can improve our tolerance of carbon dioxide so that we can keep a little bit more acidity in, so we can benefit from that Bohr effect of oxygen to be released more readily, and we can stay in control of our breath. That's a massive effect on like your psychology, your body language, but also then our performance. If the body can be conditioned and adapted to more acidic environments, then you're able to deal with lactate threshold being improved as well. And we that's a lot of the work that we do with the professional athletes we work with, where increasing the buffering capacity of their tissues to help them work at higher intensities and recover faster and have less time to fatigue. That's where a lot of the work that we do with the effectively like the CO2 tolerance work is effectively holding the breath whilst you do something.
And it's as simple as that. Hold your breath.
Yeah, I know. So simply though, it's just your brain is responsive to carbon dioxide. Like it's not as simple as that, but that's basically like that can be a bit of the takeaway.
Yeah, no, I love that. And that's where we're heading. We're getting into that performance conversation. But before we do, obviously, we need that sort of benchmark, that way to measure where we're at and where we're going, and that is via the BOLT score, body oxygen level test. And I remember when I first did it myself, I was not great. I'm much better
Yeah,
now. I've
yeah,
still got a lot of work to do, but it's great because
yeah,
it does give us something to measure by.
yeah,
So, what is the Bolt score? How do we do it, and how does it work?
yeah. So the Bolt score is in the Buteyko method, they call it control pause. In some of the studies that they've done, using it as a marker for dysfunctional breathing or measuring someone's breathing, is they just call it like a breath, like a relaxed breath hold till first desire to breathe. Essentially, what we're doing is if after you've finished a normal exhale, your breathing cycle, the next step in your breathing cycle is to pause and then breathe in. And what we're looking for is going, if we're understanding what we just mentioned there about carbon dioxide. So at the end of my normal exhale, if I stop, I'm not breathing anymore. So I'm pausing. Carbon dioxide levels are rising. I'm not taking any more oxygen in. At some point, that carbon dioxide level is going to rise, where those chemoreceptors in the central chemoreceptors in the brainstem go, okay, Jacko, you need to breathe now because we've noticed that carbon dioxide has come up and that's affecting the pH. Like, breathe. And the time difference of that pause before you feel the first stimulus to breathe without any willpower, that is then giving us an indication of how, on a biochemistry level, like what's your chemosensitivity like to carbon dioxide. So taking willpower out of it, take the psychology part out of it. So a relaxed breath hold after a normal exhale to your first definite desire to breathe in. As I say, when I first did it, I was less than 10. We want it to be around 20, ideally 25 is where all the studies have shown, like 25 and above is where we see people have less likely to have dysfunctional breathing and sensitivity to carbon dioxide issues. Which, when you first do, if you're not really paid attention to your breathing, it's highly likely that we're over breathing during the day because of just the stresses of modern day life. Where a number of other factors that go into affecting our breathing, and our brain is adapting, but negatively adapting to you breathing poorly, and so you become far more sensitive to carbon dioxide.
So, how do we improve that?
Good question. So, like, we improve it by what we mentioned before around going your day-to-day breathing. Can you make sure that it's in and out through the nose, and can you make sure it's quiet? So our day-to-day breathing, I'm honing those habits and those patterns of breathing slower and breathing calmer and breathing, essentially breathing less air. And that then will start to be, because in the background, your brain's always monitoring those levels of pH in blood and carbon dioxide. So it's not a case of like, right, for 20 minutes, do this really good exercise, and then for the rest of the day, don't pay any attention. Because if you do that, then the brain will respond to whatever it's being stimulated by the most, which is your day-to-day breathing. During exercise, then we've got the opportunity where carbon dioxide levels are building up, because you're starting to exercise, you're creating more, and we can then utilize that as an opportunity to let the body, rather than getting rid of it all the time, try to be in control of our breathing and try to spend some time where actually you resist the urge to breathe faster and get rid of it, and actually keep a little bit more within the system. And then, like, specifically, doing that in quite a forceful way for your CO2 tolerance would be holding the breath. We do it after a normal exhale, so that with breath holding, essentially what we're trying to do is we're trying to create an environment that the body's going to adapt to. We want it to adapt to lower levels of oxygen and higher levels of CO2. And in order to make that happen fast, we do the breath hold after an exhale. Because if you do a breath hold after taking a big breath in and fill the lungs with air, any blood any oxygen that's leaving the blood that is then going to replenished by that big breath of air you've took into the lungs, and you're not going to get that blood oxygen saturation dropping so quickly. Whereas we're trying to be efficient with the time as well, so we get a stronger response to our breath holding. You won't hold your breath as long, we get a stronger response, and that's what we're after. So we get a stronger response by doing a breath hold after a normal exhale. You don't have to get rid of all the air, just normal in, normal out, pinch the nose. And There's some really nice research out recently. There's one in basketball in 2020. Warons is one of the researchers. 2018 did one with rugby players, where they're showing that the more sport specific you can make your breath holding work, the greater the adaptation. So in rugby, they were doing repeat sprints over 40 meters. In basketball, they were doing like changes of direction. And showing that or theorizing that the improvements that they were seeing, like the rugby players had a 10 in a 4-week trial, the group that held their breath compared to the group that were allowed to breathe normally during these 40-meter sprint training increased their repeat sprint ability in 4 weeks by a factor of 10 compared to the non-breath hold group. Like, it was just insane, like, improvements. And their body, they were conditioning their body to deal with their oxygen levels were dropping much sharper because they were holding the breath, and they weren't letting that CO2 out. So the anaerobic environment that they were creating compared to the normal group that was sprinting was just much stronger. And then the body, you're basically forcing the body to have to a stronger stimulus by holding the breath, meaning that then you get a faster adaptation. They were theorizing that all of that acidity that's going to get created by holding the breath and keeping it in whilst they were sprinting in the rugby one, the muscle compartments themselves actually get better at buffering all of that acid before it actually goes and transfers into the blood. So hence why if you're a cyclist, then you want it to, don't do it when you're out on the road or whatever, but on a stationary bike, like, it would be beneficial to do your breath holds when you're actually on a stationary bike in a safe environment in the gym, because that's going to condition those muscles to be able to buffer more effectively.
So 2 things on that. You said that specifically the basketballers, it was 4 weeks that they noticed, that difference, and a big one at that. Was that right?
The rugby one was 4 weeks. I'm not sure.
Was it? Okay.
So the rugby one in 2018 was 4 weeks. I can't remember off the top of my head how many weeks long the study in the basketball one was. It may well have been the same.
Yeah. It was in saying that, what's the frequency we're looking at? So how often are they practicing those breath holds in their training?
Yeah. So effectively, like, the warm-up is a great opportunity to do some breath holds when you're sort of doing lower level activity, as well as, like, you can integrate them into sessions. So in that 4-week trial, and this is where we have to go as a coach, understanding, like, when they do a study, they're trying to, like, just restrict as many things as possible so they can find out, like, what's actually the thing that's happening. And so just because this is what they did in the study doesn't mean that you have to follow that. But if you understand the principles of it, then you can find ways to adapt or integrate it into your training. That's one of the biggest things I do with the professional rugby teams and players that I work with, is trying to help them to integrate it into what they already do, like maximize, get more out of what they're already doing, rather than asking them just to do another training session. So in that 4-week trial, they did 7 sessions. Someone put my fingers up. They did seven sessions. There's a podcast I can't see anyway. They did 7 sessions. In week 1, they did 1 session. And then after that, they did 2 sessions a week. And these were 40-meter repeat sprints every 30 seconds. So if it takes you 6 seconds to do a 40-meter sprint, you're going to have 24 seconds rest. I've done these, like, it's pretty miserable. But that's what they did. Like, that's a fast turnaround. And so they swapped their conditioning work during the season when they were doing this test for those sessions. So it wasn't any extra session. It was, instead of their conditioning work, they did those sessions instead. And that was with professional rugby players, I think, in Ireland. So I've done some stuff where we, starting with, say, like 2 sets of 6, and build our way up to, like, 3 sets of 6 or 3 sets of 8 gradually, but not starting at a 30-second turnaround, because you can start with that and it's flipping miserable. You need to see some ways to progressively condition yourself, or, like, starting by doing them every minute, then doing them every 50 seconds, then every 45, then 40, then 30, and work our way down to that. One of the really interesting things with it is, like, you end up like you're not working max effort. Like the repeat sprintability in that test was staying 85% of their max speed. As soon as they dropped to less than 85%, the test was over when they did the test at the beginning at the end. And what's quite interesting from a conditioning point of view in terms of repeat sprints and like anaerobic conditioning work is that we can make our athletes work at less than that max threshold. So less strain on, less chance of you pulling your hamstring. Because I'm only going to ask you to run at 85%, but you're going to hold the breath. So that then increases that part of the training. For their out and out speed work, well, then you're going to want to do that speed work then separately. But what it can allow us to do is like have a potential for less injury risk during anaerobic like conditioning work. But then also we can think of, well, what about when I'm working with someone that say they've broken? I mean, there's a guy I'm working with he's had a knee operation. He's out for like 9 months. When you can't work at that sort of threshold, you get deconditioned. But there's stuff that he can do that's low level activity, but we can add the breath hold in so that his body still has to spend some time with low oxygen and high levels of CO2. So to try and minimize the amount of like anaerobic conditioning work that they lose or capacity that they lose. And I was talking to one of the physios I work with, saying like, what's the hardest session that the guys have to do when they're coming back from injury? It's when it's like, right, you can now actually work quite hard at a high intensity. It's like first you've done your rehab, you may be 3 months into your rehab program or weeks or however long it is, and it's like now you can actually put some load through this leg or shoulder or whatever it is, and it's like we're going to work quite hard now. And it's like it's absolutely miserable because they've just spent 6 weeks, 3 months, whatever it is, doing no anaerobic work, and the body's become deconditioned. Whereas we can keep them sort of staying topped up, so it's less stress on the system when they do go back into that hard work. And that's only going to be beneficial for the just the smoothness of that rehabilitation.
I love that. That's brilliant. There's no excuses now with injuries. You also said one thing I wanted to come back to was doing breath holds sports specific. So if we're looking at someone who, I mean, a triathlete is quite interesting because there's 3 disciplines in that. So can we talk
Yeah,
about someone like a triathlete, but then also someone like your CrossFit athlete who's doing so much high intensity
yeah,
and explosive movements, and then
yeah,
potentially will have a break if they're doing an EMOM or whatever it is. How do
yeah,
you get sport specific for those athletes?
yeah. No, really good. So I work with some professional triathletes, and like I say, it's interesting one because they've got like 3 different disciplines, and the breath being quite different in all of them. In the swimming is great because you can't just breathe whenever you want. You can't pant. You can't. You can't. It's impossible. So anyone that's done any swimming, and even if you don't like swimming, I often recommend it as a. I'm terrible at swimming, but I've tried to practice because it gives you the chance to work on you have to work on your breathing. If you can't breathe well, you can't control your breathing and breathe at specific points when you're turning during strokes, then you
Then
can't,
you
you're
drown.
going to drown. So the swimming part is really interesting, and there's been loads, and because of that, there's loads of research in and work done in swimming on like hypoxic training. So hypoxia just being fancy word for the low oxygen. So in their warm-ups, they'll often do like a see how far you can swim underwater. Um, or they'll do like cadence where it's like, start breathing every 3rd stroke, then breathe every 5th stroke, then breathe every 7th stroke, then breathe every 9th stroke, trying to do a time delay in how long they can pause for in between breaths and strokes, which is like, intermittent breath holding effectively. So it fits in with swimming very sort of normally. An element with the cycling is interesting is I think is the most interesting is the position, the posture. So bent over, restricting like rib movement and actually having to breathe more posteriorly. So we'll do some work on actually being able to open up the back of the rib cage to allow them to still breathe well and still breathe deep with the diaphragm, but more posterior sort of breathing capacity by just some simple like rib mobilizations and that type of thing. And you can do some breath holding. You could do some like repeat, but you could do some breath holding in any sessions where, for safety, when you're on a stationary bike or turbo, whatever you're in, you're not trying to do it when you're out on the road on a bike. But we've got two options really with something like that, where we can do them in the warm up of a session, where we just interspace them by like a minute or 2 minutes, so you got some decent rest between, but do some like quite strong breath holds in the warm up. One of the nice things about doing them in a warm up is one of the responses to the low oxygen is the spleen contracts. After challenge, it's been the strongest contraction of the spleen has been shown to be able to happen after 5 challenging breath holds of around 30 seconds. So what that means is the spleen's like a blood bank, holds about 8% additional red blood cells, and it contracts to release those blood cells to basically go, the brain's noticing that oxygen's low because you're holding your breath. And it's like, how can I help? It's like, okay, here's some more red blood cells, like a few more red blood cells. That's an increase in the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. This will make me sound clever now, but it's only because I presented this yesterday in that there was a 20%. After the research was like 20%, the research was like 20% contraction of the spleen after those 5 challenging breath holds, and it increased red blood cell count from like 2.8 to 9.6% or something like that. But basically, like you're getting like less than 10, but like percent, but it's still like even just a few percent. And if you do these and allow yourself to recover before you then start your exercise, but do it in your warm up, you'll feel the difference of like, you just feel like you've got a bit more capacity. Your breathing is just, everything feels a little bit easier at the start, but then you start working hard and then you're into it. So that's in a warm up, or you could do them in a bike session where you go, okay, we're actually going to do some intervals of like bouts of work, like the repeat sprints, but rather than running and going every 30 seconds, I'm just going to go for like a 6-7 second breath hold, like on the bike, and then do a couple of sets of 6 of those, for example. To start with, you might do it every minute, but then trying to work those way down to those ones that are sort of every 30 seconds. But anything where you're starting to get the body conditioned to that anaerobic environment. So if you're doing a session where not a session on your bike where you like have to work at a particular intensity because it's going to affect that, but where you're able to, if it's like some anaerobic conditioning work, it just makes sense to just hold the breath whilst you do those few bouts of work. And then in a CrossFit sort of environment or anything where it's like super high intensity like that, the breath holds in your warm up, just like what I mentioned with the bike, is applicable, because to have an increase in red blood cell count, which can last for up to about an hour, and then eventually the spleen will reabsorb those red blood cells. But you're going to benefit from having more red blood cells. More red blood cells are going to help your oxygen carrying capacity of the blood, but also with the transport out of carbon dioxide if you've got more red blood cells. So with the really high intensity stuff, it's starting to understand that like when I feel like I need to get more oxygen in, that stimulus to breathe in strongly and breathe faster, it's not that oxygen's low, that's more to do with the carbon dioxide. So understanding how I manage my airflow and stay in control of my breathing and stay away from the panting, which is really inefficient in terms of you end up breathing, because it's so fast and there's little resistance with that mouth wide, you end up breathing to the upper chest. There's less blood within the lungs that high up, and the greatest density of alveoli within the lungs is low down. So you're missing out on sending oxygen to where it needs to go to be efficiently transferred into the blood. You're offloading all that carbon dioxide, like I mentioned before, so oxygen is then that's in the blood, staying in the blood, or more strongly attached. You're not benefiting from that Bohr effect that we mentioned. So staying in control of your breath, trying to take bigger, slower breaths, and if that needs to be through the mouth, we try to encourage ourselves to like do the opposite of the worst thing. So if the worst thing is the mouth wide and fast and shallow, if I'm going to have to if my nose can't handle it, but I'm going to have to use my mouth. I'm going to use my, I like to use the phrase, use your mouth like a nose. What does that mean? It means create some resistance with it. So rather than being wide and open, I can breathe in with my mouth. If I'm breathing in deep there, I'm breathing slower and it's not running away from me. It's not racing away from me. I'm staying in control of it. And then ultimately, I'm trying to get myself back to a point of, in recovery bouts, get back to a point of being able to get back to nasal breathing, which is a little bit calmer for the nervous system, also for the mind, so you can stay focused and concentrated. A lot of the time in high intensity work, it's like the increase in CO2 and the depletion of oxygen means that like it's hard to stay focused and concentrate. So if you can get yourself back to your breathing under control, you can actually help with that blood flow, oxygen supply to the brain, to your levels of focus and concentration. The last thing I'm saying, in really high intensity stuff, where you're like breathing is literally like, it's got to that point where it's like, I've lost it. Well, remembering that it's carbon dioxide that's making you lose it, we can specifically, we call it like CO2 dumping, like get rid of CO2 is great, it's good, but too much of it, like anything, too much of it is bad. It's driving your breathing out of control. I can like a few specific dumps of get rid of that CO2 effectively and quickly so that I can regain my breathing back under control is going to be beneficial for trying to recover quickly during bouts of like super high intensity work. The caveat is, if you're always dumping off CO2, you're not improving your tolerance of it. So if you can handle keeping the CO2 in the body during a training session, then you're conditioning your body to deal with that. It's going to feel uncomfortable. It's not going to feel nice, but you're conditioning your body to deal with that, which will then benefit you then when you go into your actual like competition work. And so then in competition work, it is, dump the CO2 during competition, because it's if it's driving your breathing too much out of control. Ultimately, it's about being able to stay in control of our breath. And we all know this, of like, when you're out of control, when your breathing's out of control, it feels bad. Like it looks bad. Body language. If you see, if you're out running with someone, or you're in a competition and we're racing, and someone starts creeping up behind you, but you can hear them like, and you're not breathing like that, even though they're coming up behind you and catching you up, you're like, how's this going to play out? Because I feel like I've got more in the tank than you. Just because intuitively you're hearing their breathing. Whereas and we've all will have experienced this, you're like blowing out of your ass, you're like, and someone goes up behind you and they're like, it looks like they're barely even breathing, you can't hear them, you're like, oh shit. And that's before we knew anything about breathing. We know intuitively because it's built into us as part of our stress response. If someone's breathing fast out of the mouth, it's a sign of either they're working hard or something's wrong. Think about the last time you saw someone that was super stressed, not through exercise, just stressed through life. It's like, intuitively it's built into us to be able to recognize that, because your brain wants to recognize if someone else is in danger, it wants to know, because if someone else is in danger that you can see, it might be that you're in danger as well. So it's a part of that safety mechanism.
Yeah,
Hopefully that makes sense.
absolutely. Oh, absolutely. I'd love to get into the breathing exercises in a moment, but I wanted to touch on nasal breathing. When I first got into this work, I actually found the exercises to be quite intimidating because I guess there was an element of anxiety around holding my breath. And so instead, what I would do, I would just go for my runs, whether it was a 5K, and just concentrate on breathing through my nose. So just complete nasal breathing, jogging. It was easier to manage because I could just slow down when it was getting too much. So slow down, keep breathing through the nose.
Cool.
So in terms of the nasal breathing, and I guess for me, it was that steady state exercise at nasal breathing. Is that going to have the same effect as the breath holds, or eventually do we really need to start doing the breath holds something more intense so that we do improve that tolerance to carbon dioxide? and improve performance eventually.
Yeah, no, yeah. I guess the way I sort of look at it or explain it is that um, the breath holding is it's a stress on the system. It's forcing adaptations, whereas and it lasts for a small amount of time. Whereas you go out for a run and you nasal breathe and you feel the feeling of air hunger building up, or even just sat stationary, you do some breathing light exercises like practice of trying to breathe less air, trying to breathe slower, feel the urge to breathe in a little bit stronger, but just relax into it, and you're spending some time with the body experiencing that air hunger, which we've highlighted. That feeling of air hunger, the need to breathe, is coming from increased levels of carbon dioxide. So doing it sat down and just experiencing that, or going out for a run and experiencing it, is maybe giving you like a longer period of time for those changes to CO2 tolerance to take place, but in a less forceful way. Like you say, when I first tried to do some breath holds, trying to do like 20 paces, we should be able to do 60 to 100. To try and do 20, I thought I was like suffocating. I thought I was drowning. It was like suffocating myself. It's like, this is mad. Yeah. And it's like then the psychological element of that kicks in. From a sporting perspective, there's a good reason to train the breath holding because of the psychological relationship you then have with breathing, as well as at the end of a breath hold, you let go, a real strong one. It's like your body wants to go to that like path of least resistance, which just because it's automatic, it doesn't mean it's optimal. And so it's an opportunity to retrain habits of like breathe better. Breathe with the diaphragm, breathe lower down, take bigger, slower breaths rather than the finish your breath hold and go back to that panting. So it's an opportunity in isolation of a breath hold, in isolation away from like the challenges of your sport, to be able to practice good functional breathing mechanics under the stress of like my breathing being out of control, but without the stress of the actual sport or exercise. But yeah, the nasal breathing when you're running and breath control in that, it's running. I found running a fantastic way to just connect with the breath. And I did my first marathon last year, and I'm training at the moment for an ultra marathon, which is 200 kilometers, about 135 miles in 3 days around little island in North Wales, Anglesey. Yeah, it's called the Ring of Fire. Whoa. The Ring of Fire. Yes. Awful. Well, save the wows for like if I manage to do it. Last year, 100 people signed up, 43 finished it. So the success rate is less than 50%. It's pretty brutal. So, but I've been running. I've been trying to get better at running, not to be better at running as the exercise, but to get better at breathing. Running just being that, like you say, nice low level aerobic stuff where you're like, it's cyclical, it's rhythmical, like you're breathing. It's not difficult in terms of like the skill of it. And so you can actually like zone out and then actually zone in more internally on your breathing. Now, as I mentioned right at the start about your dysfunctional breathing, you might not notice it at rest because your breathing's not being challenged. As soon as you start running, your heart rate increases, your body starts needing more oxygen, it starts creating more CO2. And what's going to happen is your breathing will respond to that. And then it's your opportunity as you're running to go like, okay, how am I responding? Like, oh, where am I? Like now I can feel that I'm breathing to my chest rather than lower down, or the speed at which I'm breathing, or the sound I'm making. So you can start to tune in to the breath and use a simple low level sort of aerobic work like on like running, to really be able to listen and hear. And when I say listen to your breath, not the audible sound, but not even just that, like more than that, like deeply to it, like on what's it saying to you on the inside. And every time I go out for a run now, it's just an opportunity to experience the breath more deeply and connect with it. And that's been a massive eye opener, for me. Best thing that I've done from a breathing, for sure.
Yeah, that's it. And I mean, the self-awareness that comes from it is so important. And I think, even what you were saying before in terms of like the breath holds, when they're so intense, when you then take a breath, even though the drive or the feeling will be that big gulp of air afterwards,
Yeah.
just because that's the feeling doesn't mean that's good for you, optimal, or what you should be doing, even though that's the feeling of what you need. And so understanding that and understanding that you can actually change that, which is better for you, psychologically does so much.
Yeah, I was saying the psychological element is this again. It's funny having this conversation, like just say because it came up. It came up this week where that psychological dimension. I don't think I have explored it, but it just seems every now and again like certain things just keep cropping up, and it's like um, that psychological relationship plays a huge role, huge role in our breathing, and I think that gets overlooked. Overlooked quite a lot, and the breath holding is a great way to train that. Just don't make it too stressful, particularly at the start. You
Yeah,
don't need to make it stressful.
exactly. Um, I would love for you to quickly, if you do know, the difference between Wim Hof and oxygen advantage, because this is something that comes up frequently, and I'm sure you've been asked this a bazillion times.
Yeah, yeah. I'm making a YouTube video to try and go into some detail of
Oh,
it. On
good.
the so as a master instructor, I teach the certification, and it's actually later today the current group that I'm teaching are on, and there's a session where we look at it specifically because if you're always going to get asked it. And I think that try and break it down. I'll try and make it as simple as possible. In that, like, I was going to use like an analogy, but I won't. I'll actually just go for the. If you think that Wim Hof method is ice, cold exposure, mindset, and breathing. So to start with, the breathing part of it is only 1/3 of it. So it's not even fair on it to just do a straight comparison to it because you're only comparing 1/3 of it. The oxygen advantage is only about breathing. Nothing else. It's just breathing. Yeah. The other big difference is the third of the Wim Hof method that is breathing. It's not teaching you how to breathe. It's using breathing as a powerful tool to change your physiology, to make hormonal changes, to make the body to respond. A bit like the breath holding, like forcing the body to respond. It creates some significant levels of hypoxia, so low oxygen. After a few rounds of the hyperventilation, you hold your breath for a very long time because you've got rid of the CO2. So your stimulus to breathe isn't there. You hold your breath for a very long time. Oxygen drops down very low. It can go into like the 60s, or even it can go into that sort of 50% blood oxygen saturation levels where people can actually pass out. Whereas, but so the oxygen can go super low, so you can get the same level. You're going to get even lower levels of hypoxia, but the carbon dioxide levels are really low because you're blowing it all off to allow that to happen. Whereas with the oxygen advantage, we're teaching you how to breathe rather than using breathing as a tool to make changes. We use the breath holding to force the body to adapt. But the big difference is we have the low oxygen as well, so we have the hypoxia, but we're doing it with the hypercapnia, the high CO2, whereas the Wim Hof is low oxygen and low CO2. So if you're comparing the Wim Hof with the breath holding from the oxygen advantage, that's the big difference is to do with the CO2. The biggest difference overall is that, just to make that point, that the oxygen advantage is teaching you how to breathe better at rest, how to breathe better during physical exercise, how to improve your performance, how to improve your recovery, how to manage your airflow, how to diaphragmatically breathe, how to functionally breathe. It's teaching you about breathing, whereas Wim Hof method is 1/3 of his method, and it's using the breath as a powerful tool to make some changes to the body and doing some incredible things. So I'm not trained as a Wim Hof instructor, and that doesn't then mean that I don't think the guy is doing incredible things and I'd love to meet him one day and think he's doing amazing stuff. It's just not what I personally practice.
Yeah. Yeah. Brilliant. Those who mouth breathe, they've got a blocked nose, they've got whatever's going on. When you tell them breathe through the nose, they're always like, no, I can't. I feel like I'm drowning, or I'm
Yeah.
suffocating. I can't breathe through the nose. I can only breathe through the mouth. What do you say to them, and what's their journey going to look like? Trying to
Um,
transition, I guess.
yeah, yeah. I mean, you can appreciate. We have to appreciate if someone's got like a broken nose or deviated septum, got some issues there. Like there's going to be some physical things that are making it more difficult. But for a lot of people, and I've had a client before where he was booked in for a operation on his nose. We did a few sessions together, and after 2 weeks, he cancelled his operation because his nose, it wasn't like sort of back to perfect, but he didn't really want to have an operation on it. But it cleared from some of the exercises we were doing. It had cleared enough that he was happy, and I think that's a great little win. My personal experience, I tried to go out for a run, like I got to the end of my road, nasal breathing, which is about 50 meters, and there was just snot like pouring down into my mouth. It was gross. And I was like, I was like, I can't, I can't do it. I was like, I can't do this. Why can't I breathe through my nose? And again, it was that opportunity where my ego didn't get the better of me. In the typically the ego would go, well, must be rubbish. Like if I can't do it, like maybe my nose isn't designed for breathing. Whereas, it's just ridiculous. So understanding that everyone's nose, there's 30 different functions of your nose, it shows it's designed for breathing. Like you're not special in that you're better mouth breathing. We're all beautifully and uniquely different, but we're wired the same in terms of how our nervous system works, how our respiratory system works. So yeah, trying to keep the mouth closed and allow your body to the chance to spend some time trying to breathe through the nose. You'll be surprised how much it will clear by just making it have no other choice. Like you won't let you die. And there's a specific exercise. If it feels really blocked, we can do this now, where if you try and take a breath in through the nose quite strongly, just notice how blocked it feels, and then just test one compared to the other. So like often both of mine will feel clear, but this morning, for example, my left nostril feels a little bit more blocked, and sometimes one feels more blocked than the other, and the brain goes through a cycle apparently every 90 minutes or something like that, and switches between them. But a little breath hold and nodding of the head can help to stimulate a gas in the nose. The bacteria in the nose creates called nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is a vasodilator, plays another antiviral, plays a number of vital roles in the body. But as a vasodilator, when you hold the breath and pinch the nose and trap it in there, and then breathe it in afterwards, it can help to clear the nose. So we'll try this together. So you go normal breath in, normal breath out, pinch the nose, and then hold the breath, nod the head maybe like 10 times. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Let go and breathe in. And even just after that one tiny little thing, my left nostril now feels a little bit clearer than it was. Like it was 10 head nods is very, very easy. If you can try to do it, if you do it a little bit stronger, you can get a stronger response. So we'll just do another one. Let's go for like 20 if that feels okay. And if it feels great, then go for a little bit longer if you do feel like it. So just normal breath in, normal breath out, pinch the nose. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Let go, breathe in. Then check in. Yeah. Like nose feeling clearer from having just done the simplest little exercise.
Yeah.
And sometimes people will do that for the first time. They're like, wow. And it's like, is it that easy? And it's like, that's the beauty of it. It's that easy.
Yeah. Yeah, it's brilliant. It's just committing to it as well, and knowing that you'll be okay. I think again it comes back to that psychological element as well.
Yeah, yeah, definitely, for sure.
Jacko, this has been sensational. Tell us, you've got an app, is
Oh,
that
I'm glad
right?
you've enjoyed it. Yeah, you did. I just have to say something. You did just then, as you were composing yourself. What to say? You went like this. That's been said. I was like, that was a vertical upper chest, like dysfunctional breathing sort of sigh. And I was like, I thought that I had done a good job
Like
in this in this yeah, but it just shows us. But obviously,
habits, right?
that's almost like a habit. Yeah, of going like, right, I'm composing myself to like what I'm going to say, and it was like I'm just going to take this big breath in. But yeah, it's
I
one
still
of
catch
the. But
myself
this
holding
is
my
where it's
breath.
unfair.
You know, during the
Yeah,
this
that's
podcast, I'm
like a
like, oh,
thing of.
keep breathing.
Yeah, don't, yeah, but it's but we don't have to. Yeah, we don't have to. We will keep breathing. We don't have to until we take that last one. But yeah, no, I've got a there's an app that's called Pro Breathwork. So if you search on the App Store, on Google, or on iPhone, Pro Breathwork. There's a free foundations course on there which has I think there's about 9 modules taking through all the basics of like understanding the mechanics, some of the assessments, and working your way through some exercises to follow, to listen to literally just listen and follow along. And within the app, there's that's all free. There's tracking for like things like your bolt score and your respiratory rate. You can keep a track of those through the app itself, and just keep a monitor on how you're doing, how you're improving. There's some of the courses on there for like sports performance and live sessions and stuff that we do, but the foundations course is going to give you the basics, and I want to make those basics sort of that everyone can benefit from, make those available for free to. Well, you've got to have a phone, I guess, haven't you? That's the stumbling block that most people this day and age do.
But that's awesome, though, having something, you know, such an important resource where it's all there for you and all you need to do is follow along is really, really important. So, so glad you've got something out there like that, and we'll make sure that's in the show notes for everyone to get onto. And how can people find you if they just want to
Cool.
follow along, follow your journey, or even take part in your next course?
Yeah, probably the best place is just on Instagram. So Instagram is jacko.david.jackson. All my names in there. Yeah, fairly active on Instagram. Yeah, get in touch. You'll see the sort of type of things I'm doing with my own training, and I'd love people up at that the ultra marathon ring. Whoa, the Ring of Fire that I'm doing is 2nd to the 4th of September. So if people will be able to like get involved and help support that, doing it for the Petals charity, find out. I'll send you I'll put a link in. I'll send you a link, so find out a little bit about what it's about, why I'm doing it, and what the charity is for. But yeah, we're going to be sharing all that sort of stuff over on the gram, on the Instagram.
Brilliant. You did say you'd give us
Oh,
a diaphragmatic breath exercise.
oh
Shall
yeah.
we do that
Finish
now?
on finish. Yeah. I thought
Unless
you were going
people
to
are
sign off
driving,
with
that
my.
puts them.
I thought you were going to sign off with my keep it nasal. Yeah, no.
Leave that to you.
Yeah. Yes. So proprioception of the trunk is typically difficult, and there's a lot of often people there'll be a bit of miscommunication from the brain of and feeling of what you feel of like abdominal muscles and the diaphragm, like the abdominal muscles being on the outside, the diaphragm being much deeper inside. And actually, if you were to do if I asked you to like tense your diaphragm, contract your diaphragm, if you tense your bicep, you know how to do it. But so tense your diaphragm. It's like, what do people do? Typically, like, we'll tense our abs. And it's like, well, tensing your abs isn't your diaphragm. If I ask you to put your hands on your abdominal muscles and then do a strong mouth exhale, what tenses when you do a strong exhale?
Abs.
Your abs.
Everything.
Yeah.
Everything, yeah.
So
Torso.
your abdominals tensing. Yeah, they're pulling the ribs down and in for the exhale. We know that the diaphragm contracts on an inhale. So it can't be that same sensation. The diaphragm contracting on an inhale, we can help to feel what that muscle contraction is like by doing, like, simplest of anything is always like an isometric contraction. So what we're going to do is put your hand, find where your lower two ribs are and the angle where they meet underneath your sternum. Put your hand there, because that's sort of where the diaphragm is going to sit. And then do a normal breath in and normal breath out. Pinch the nose, but then whilst you're holding your breath, try and breathe in. And you'll feel underneath where that hand is, like your diaphragm is trying to pull down. There you go. You're like, yeah, you can tell when someone's got it. It's like, crack, it feels weird. But it's like your diaphragm's trying to pull down, but you're holding the breath. So you're not letting it pull down. So it's like trying to jump out of you. It's trying to go somewhere, but you feel it pulsing. And that's similar. It's not your abs, but it's in a similar area. So it gets confused for some people a lot of the time. And that was a big game changer for me to answer that question of like, am I diaphragmatic breathing? How do I know if I'm using my diaphragm? It's like, well, try this. And you're like, oh, that's my diaphragm. It's like, well, now next time you take a breath, just try to connect to that same sensation, but just let the air come in rather than hold the breath.
That
and you're like,
is
okay,
sensational. That is the best thing that I've ever done. I've never done that before, and holy shit! Of course, it's a game changer.
So easy.
It gets that brain body connection. Oh, that's what it is. Where it is, what I'm doing.
Yeah, we should have done that at the start, shouldn't we? Sorry.
Yeah. No, that was my fault. I said I will wait for that.
No. Yeah.
So good. Okay.
No, cool.
Everyone needs to do that. And for those listening, obviously this is going to be on YouTube as well. So if you need to see it, head to YouTube. Jacko, you're a legend. Thank you so much for chatting with me today. This has been awesome.
No, thanks for having me.
That was Jacko from Oxygen Advantage. Go and download his app, Pro Breathwork. It is fantastic and the perfect place to start if you want to be learning, or you should be wanting to learn more about the way you breathe, the way you can make that better, and how to improve every aspect of your life, basically. But if you're someone who does really train a lot, this will give you an edge. If you have a really good understanding of your breathing and how you can get better by using your breathing, this will give you an edge. So go onto the app page and download Pro Breathwork. You can do it for free. It's the foundations of breathwork, and it gives you everything you need to start your journey to improved performance. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I appreciate you. If this show was of value to you and you know it will help someone else, then please share it with your friends and family and give us a review, because everything helps this little podcast going strong. Again, thank you. Have the best day, week, month, and year. And here's to a world of bodies built better.